You know that feeling, right? You lose an argument, a game, whatever, and you just wish you could get a do-over, a second chance to make your case. Well, that feeling is at the absolute heart of the story we're diving into today. A legal fight where getting that second chance came with a twist nobody saw coming. So let's just imagine this for a second. You've gone through a whole legal battle, and you lose. But then you get news. The judge has granted you a rehearing. Is this it? Is this your golden ticket to go back in there, re-argue everything, and snatch victory from the jaws of defeat? Well, as we're about to find out, the answer is way, way more complicated than you'd think. And to really get why, we're going to look at a specific case, Samantha and Millard Finch versus their Homeowners Association, the Mountain Gate community. Now, this is a classic kind of neighborhood dispute, but it took this really unusual turn that ended up being a masterclass in the fine print of legal rules. Okay, so here's the quick timeline. On February 26th, boom, the Finches lose their case, but they are not giving up. About a month later, they file a petition for a rehearing. And then, on April 29th, they get what seems like amazing news. The rehearing is granted. For them, it must have felt like the door to justice had just swung wide open again. But here's where the whole story pivots. This was not a blank check to retry the entire case. This rehearing came with some very specific, and I mean very narrow rules. And this is where the difference between a second chance and a total do-over becomes crystal clear. So what even is a rehearing? Well, in the legal world, it's a chance to take another look at something that's already been decided. But you got to pay really close attention to that last part. The grounds for that reexamination are often extremely limited. It doesn't mean you just get to stand up and rehash all your old arguments. And in this case, the Department of Real Estate was super specific. They didn't just say, all right, let's hear the whole thing all over again. No. They granted the rehearing based on one and only one particular reason. And that little detail set the stage for a major, major disconnect. Okay. This slide right here, this lays out the rules of the game. This is the aha moment. The rehearing was only for looking at procedural mistakes, things like an error in how evidence was handled or a legal mistake made during the hearing. What it was absolutely not for was arguing that the judge's original findings were wrong, that the decision was unfair, or that the judge just plain ignored evidence. And that distinction right there is everything. So because of this fundamental misunderstanding, you end up with this courtroom conversation where the two sides are on completely different tracks. It's like they're not even in the same room. The Finches came ready to argue about the facts, about the injustice of it all. But the judge could only listen for one very specific thing, a procedural error. So Miss Finch kicks things off by going right at the heart of why she thinks the first decision was wrong. She says the evidence itself wasn't consistent. To her, this is the error. She's challenging the facts head-on. And the judge, Kay Abramson, has to step in almost immediately. She has to correct her, pointing out that arguing about whether the evidence was considered, well, that's the same thing as saying the findings weren't supported by the evidence, which was one of the reasons for a rehearing that had been explicitly denied. And this quote just perfectly captures the human side of all of this. Miss Finch's response is so understandable, isn't it? She feels like she was wronged, and she just needs to explain why she disagrees. It's the most natural instinct in the world. But the judge has to be firm. She even references the specific part of their petition that was denied. She puts it as plainly as possible. We are not revisiting the findings of fact. You can almost feel the walls of the legal process closing in right there. And here it is, the moment of painful realization. After trying again and again to make her case about the facts, Miss Finch finally sees the incredibly narrow path she's being forced down. It's just a moment of pure frustration, where she realizes the fight she came to fight isn't the one she's actually allowed to have. So, with the petitioner not able to argue the points they came to argue, and a judge legally unable to even hear them, the outcome was pretty much inevitable. The gavel was about to fall for a second and this time, final time. On July 3rd, the final order came down. The petition was dismissed. That second chance had completely evaporated. For the Finches, it was the exact same outcome as the first time. So the really important thing here is to understand why. The case was dismissed because the Finches couldn't prove the one thing they were there to prove, that a procedural error happened. They kept talking about the outcome, about why the judge's decision was wrong. But in the court's view, those arguments were improperly raised. They just failed to meet the very specific burden of proof that the rehearing required. This whole entire case really boils down to one critical legal distinction, and it's something that applies way beyond just this one HOA dispute. It's the huge difference between challenging the process of a decision versus challenging the outcome of that decision. And this slide lays it out perfectly. Think of it like two different paths you can take. A rehearing, which is what the Finches had, is all about the process. It asks, hey, were the rules followed correctly? But an appeal, that's about the outcome. That asks, was the final decision legally correct based on the facts? The Finches were trying to make an appeal argument in a rehearing court. And that right there brings us to the biggest takeaway from this whole story. In any kind of legal fight, understanding the rules of the game, the process, the how, can be just as critical, maybe even more so, than just knowing the facts of your case. So it leaves us with this really provocative question to chew on. When we're chasing after justice, we tend to focus on what's right and what's wrong, right? But as this case shows, sometimes the path to justice isn't about the facts at all, but about navigating the incredibly complex rules of the game. Definitely something to think about.